All right. Good evening, all. Let's just check in, make sure we're clear. Let's make sure the girls finished out there. The Two Geek Girls was right before. Good evening, all. Let's just check in, make sure we're clear.
Second.
Let's make sure. All right.
That's me causing problems over here because I always bring up the YouTube channel, but it isn't doing anything when I bring it up. But then when you start the show, it starts. So.
Exactly. I've been trying to keep on top of the YouTube show. We hit 1,200 subscribers on our YouTube channel, which is our current subscriber count, which is for the live streams, which is what's important is we're almost at 89,000 on the main channel, on the main Axanar channel. Let's see, we're at 88,830. So we're about, we're not too far. We're a month away from breaking 90,000, which would be big because we've been in the 80s for a while. So how are you? So, and your T-shirt says, surely not everybody was Kung Fu fighting.
Yes, which you could see better if Buddy hadn't decided to join me right here. So
the funny thing is there are certain things, like that are so pervasive that there's like whole new generations who find out who have a different relationship to that song than maybe you or I did. I mean, being a product of the 60s and 70s, when that song came out, I remember when it came out. There's just songs that are from the 70s, especially, that you're like, I can't believe that song is still a thing.
I think he's still performing.
I don't even know who it is.
It'll come to me. Carl Douglas is his name. He's like a Jamaican singer or something like that. I actually had an 8-track tape of him way back in the day, and so that day being a really long time ago. But I think I looked him up about a year or so ago, and he's like in his 70s and still performing.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Right,
I'll go through some of the comments. Varg69 says, heard the Aries now has a Mako unit. I think I sent off an email today to get it authorized. So yes. Shane Freud, how are you? There's Shane and my boy. Mojo, who is one of our, his dog, Shane's dog, is one of our fosters, one of our early fosters. And Shane, who's all the way over on the other side of the country, when we first got Mojo, Shane was like, "Oh my God, I love that dog. I want to adopt him," and did. And he flew in, back in, I guess that was October for the October shoot? Shane was here and spent time with Mojo and fell in love, and then we shipped Mojo off to him, and now Mojo is huge. I don't even recognize Mojo. When I had him, he was like all black. So someone asked about my shirt, and by the way, I am feeling better today. Someone asked, is this an Axanar dog rescue shirt? No, this is the actual El Paso Chihuahuas, which are the minor league baseball team that we stole the logo from. I've actually been in contact with them about working together and us modifying their logo, because we took their logo and we modified it, and their logo for the El Paso Chihuahuas is and it's their mascot. Let's see if I pull it up for you. Their mascot, whose name is Chico. Who you'll see. Here I'll show some of you guys what some of their logos here. Here's Chico the Chihuahua, and this one image in particular. Let's see. There's an image of him without. Well, there's him swinging a bat, but we took the image and we kind of modified it, and we came up with the Axanar dog rescue logo, And let's see if I pull that up for you guys. Here we go. So this is the.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so one of the things we had to do is Chico, the El Paso Chihuahua mascot, is snarly, you know, because Chihuahuas are known for being fierce dogs, right? And we were like, oh, that's not quite what we want to portray, you know, as a dog rescue. So I sent the logo over to the mother of my godsons, Damaris, who does so much work for us. I said, can you make him smile? And so that she sent this, and we replaced the EP for El Paso with AX for Axanar. So that's kind of our little dog, Ax, the Axanar dog rescue mascot. So there you go. There always has to be puppies talked about on our live stream. So there you go. So how are you doing, sir? Everyone's always like, Alec, how are you doing? Knowing that I, you know, most likely had COVID-19. And by the way, I find out results sometime between Monday and Wednesday this week. That's what it is. But I'm going to be shocked if it's not COVID-19, because if not, it's like the most ass-kicking flu I've ever had in my life.
If it's not, that's bad news, because there's another ass-kicking disease out there.
Right. I'm like, whoa, that wasn't COVID-19? Holy crap. You know? But, you know, COVID-19 hits everyone differently. That's one of the things they say. You know, and it all depends on it. It's like, here's the disease, and then here's you, and throw it together and roll the dice. So we'll see. How are you doing? You staying healthy?
Yeah, I'm staying healthy. I'm pretty much sequestered. I have the advantage of being able to work from home, so I've been doing that. And because my parents are in my parents are in their 80s, so, and my mother has some health issues on top of that. And so I know that I'm in the chain. I'm not the next man up, but if one of my brothers gets sick, then I'm the next man up to help with my parents. And so I'm acting as if I'm in a household that has somebody who's in a very severe risk group, and I'm sort of acting accordingly. So I went out. I actually went to the grocery store today, and Monday, I'll probably go out and get my allergy shot. And that's probably going to be it for the week.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. PJ White says, where's Pat? Pat is off tonight. He has to get up at like 4 a.m. So we figured probably not a good night to be, you know, live streaming if you're going to have to be up at 4.
No, he's so in Pat's day job, he's an airline pilot. So it's always good to have your pilot well rested. In his particular case, most of the time he's flying a simulator these days. He's a simulator instructor. But, you know, a simulator is what we would call in the military a high demand, low density asset, right? They're expensive. So you don't buy any more than you absolutely need to. And as a result, you're trying to maximize the utility of the one you've got. And the end result of that is that basically they don't quite run them 24/7, because they do have to do maintenance on the simulators, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's like any other piece of gear. But they come as close to running them 24/7 as they can within reason. And so it's not unusual from what I understand, for a pilot who has to go spend some time in the simulator to be told, yeah, your simulator slot starts at 3 a.m.
Holy crap. That's crazy.
And so Pat's for the next, I think he said that there's next weekend he'll be coming out of the simulator about the time the show ends. And then during this week, he's got a couple of times where he goes in at like 5 p.m. or something like that. So that's kind of what he's doing and why he's not here today.
Someone's and talking about simulators, you know. Oh well, there it is. There's the question. So someone answered Joshua here, so we can continue on. Joshua, someone will answer your question, because if we stop the show every time someone asks that question, we never get anything accomplished. But
you should just put a banner across the bottom.
Yeah, I think we have.
Actually, there is one.
Lissa has a banner.
Go, Lissa.
Alyssa finally made one up because she was sick and tired of people asking the question. As far as simulators go, I think, as far as the world of starships goes, I think, one of the exciting things about the future is that simulations get better and better and better.
Yeah.
Right. You look at, I'm always kind of amazed at least from what you've seen of the flight simulators, the airline simulators. You're like, wow, that looks kind of cheesy, because these days you're just like, it should be fully immersive and make you think like you're actually there, because the technology is just so mind-boggling. Right? It's amazing. Although some of my favorite flight simulator scenes are the stuff from Sully, from the movie Sully, when they recreate all that stuff, and it was so instructional. I thought, to lay people like myself about what are flight simulators for pilots like, and how do they work, and how do they operate.
Yeah, I haven't seen that movie, and I need to, because I'm a.
Oh my God!
Yeah, I just don't see very many movies, actually.
That is a wonderful, wonderful movie. It's a great performance by Tom Hanks, right? I think he's great in it. Aaron Eckhart is wonderful as his co-pilot. He's really good. And it's just a really moving movie, in so many ways. And in so many ways, you just realize it really was a miracle. It was truly a miracle. It's just like all the things that had to line up, and including their amazing judgment and experience, for him to know that they would not make another airport, and then the movie goes on talks about how is that NTSB, question on that decision, and I don't want to give it away because you got to see the movie. Yeah. It's brilliant. It's a brilliant movie, and it gets into him and how there all the issues that he went through afterwards. It's brilliant. It really, I was surprised how good it was. And Clint Eastwood. It was a Clint Eastwood movie.
Apparently, Pat is listening because he just texted me and said our Sims are like Sully's.
Yeah. Okay. Ocon says all the fingerprint. Yeah. Yes, and it's crazy that he's safe. He lands a plane in the water, and everyone survives. That the end, that's the thing you got out of that movie. Like, that was miraculous. No one died. Everyone survived. And which is just, not supposed to happen. Water landings are not supposed to be easy, I guess. Not that I've ever. What do I know? But Old Coat says it's a great movie, Alec, but it was somewhat inaccurate because the FAA never went after Sully like that. Well, yes, and I did hear that it was they upped the dramatic.
It bothers me a little bit when they do stuff like that. Like, if you've ever, I mean, of course you have seen Apollo 13.
Sure, many times.
But I don't know if you've ever listened to the audio track, the additional audio track, because they've got two of them. One of them is Ron Howard about making the movie, and the other one is Jim and Marilyn Lovell doing an audio track on the movie.
Wow. Okay.
And one of the things that Jim Lovell says is, remember that scene where there's that little bit of an argument that takes place in the lunar lander? He said, never happened. Didn't happen at all. No disagreement among the flight crew, nothing, totally mission focused. And I don't doubt that at all, but you had to add a little bit about that. But right. Michael Bay in Pearl Harbor added this entire sub theme of the conspiracy, etc. And when that Roosevelt supposedly knew that Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked, and when he was asked about it, he said that you had to make it more dramatic. And it's like, if you can't make the attack on Pearl Harbor dramatic enough, maybe movie making isn't your forte.
I don't remember them upping the conspiracy theory part of that.
It's there at least a little bit. It's been forever since I've seen that movie. But my example I always use Apollo 13 as my counterexample for that. No bad guys, one small explosion, nobody dies, everybody knows the outcome in advance.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
And yet, every time I watch that movie, I'm worried about the heat shield.
I know, right? Exactly. That is brilliant movie making.
Yeah,
it is just brilliant movie making. I actually have a soft spot in me for Pearl Harbor. That was Bay's movie where I was like, God, if they would just cut out about a third of that movie, I would have been okay with it.
I got to go back and watch it again. But the two movies I have a tendency to go to are Apollo 13, although I haven't done that in a while, and The Martian.
Oh, right. Both problem-solving space.
Yeah. I mean, I had seen The Martian in the first 22 hours it was out. I had seen it twice.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I took off of work to go see that movie in the first time slot I could see it in. And because I had, for years, anytime I went into Amazon was trying to suggest the book to me. And, it's a Robinson Crusoe story. And I don't like Robinson Crusoe stories generally because Robinson Crusoe is a guy from a high-tech society who gets to go camping against his will for years, right? And, I don't want to go camping. I don't read science fiction to read about somebody going camping, right? And so I always successfully avoided it. Then a friend of mine sends me this text message on a Saturday afternoon, and he said, I haven't gotten anything done today because I've been reading The Martian, and I can't put it down.
Yeah.
And I said, really? And he goes, oh, yeah. And so I got the audiobook. I had just finished a book, or I knew I was just going to be done. This was on a Saturday, and I knew that on Sunday I was going to need a new audiobook. So I started listening on Sunday. This was the old version that had Scott Bray, I think, as the narrator. Now, Will Wheaton narrates the newer version of it. And I haven't heard it. I assume that he does a great job. But when I hear Mark Watney, it's with Scott Bray's voice. He does a pitch perfect Mark Watney. And I went to work and was proselytizing it to all my coworkers. And at the time, I mean, I was working with Air Force officers who had the word space in their job description, space and missile in their job description. And so it's funny because I and the one other guy on Friday, we both came into work and we knew we were both going to finish listening to the audiobook on Friday. And we both said to each other, I was thinking about taking leave today just so I could stay home and listen to the book. It was that good a book that I was going to burn vacation time just so I could finish it faster.
That's good.
And then the movie comes out, and I've been, I watch the movie every couple of months.
Well, I should also point out that Andy Weir, the author of The Martian, is a huge Axanar fan.
Oh, good.
Actually, we got to meet him at Comic-Con in 2015, and which was really wonderful. And just it was so nice. Someone you really respect. I read the book before I saw the movie. My girlfriend at the time, Diana, had read it and said, "You need to read this," and I was like, "All right." And it was you can't put it down. And of course, my favorite part of the book, there's so many good parts of the book, but the one part I remember is, you end one chapter, and this is the way the whole book is. You end one chapter, and the last line of this one chapter is like, I may make it after all. And then you turn to the next chapter, and he's like, I'm so fucked. I'm gonna die.
Yeah.
And that's the way the whole book is. Him dealing with life or death on a daily basis as things go. You think something's going to work and it doesn't work, and this and that, and so,
I always tell people. Usually, I tell people read the book first, but with that one, I always say see the movie first, because the biggest difference between the book and the movie is that there's about twice as many problems that he had to solve.
Right. Yeah.
And so, you know, there'll be new stuff if you see the movie first.
I think that's a great way to look at it. Yeah. You can absolutely see the movie first, and then, God, I really want to, a different experience, and then,
But you know what I really wish Ridley Scott had done? What I really wish he had done was shot it in such a way that he was making a miniseries, and then make the miniseries version and the movie version. So you release it in the theater as the 2 hour, 2 hours and 5 minute version or whatever it is in the theater. And then when it goes on to HBO or whatever, you do the miniseries version that's like 5 hours. And you include all that other stuff in there, because there was certainly there's enough breakpoints where it's like he's totally screwed that you could do like 3 2-hour versions and easily have the, which are really like an hour and a half versions with the way we put commercials in. And you could have the breakpoints and you could just do it that way.
Yeah. No, yeah, you could. It's a wonderful work. Well, so let's talk about some space combat.
Oh yeah, we should do that.
Growing potatoes on Mars. What do we got teed up for us tonight?
So Pat and I still want to have that conversation about deflector shields, et cetera, et cetera. But I really want Pat here for that conversation. So I was thinking, I don't think that I spent a whole lot of time talking about like aircraft carriers and stuff like that. Maybe I might have done a little bit of that early on, because I think I talked about one of the early shows. I talked about what I call the 3 H's: history, hiding, and hydrodynamics.
Right.
Like how you hide behind things. And how navies hide, right? You hide behind the curve of the Earth. You hide behind the interface barrier, which is the barrier between the sea and the sky, because they have different physical properties, and as a result, a sensor that works in one doesn't work real well in the other. This is why submarines work, right? And you hide through the use of distance and maneuver. It's a big ocean. And then you hide through low observable technologies, right? And so all of these, I sort of first put these together when I was talking about the idea of hiding an aircraft carrier in particular. And we see space-going aircraft carriers as being one of those tropes that you end up with in science fiction all the time. Now, Star Trek in the idea of fighters and space-going aircraft carriers, et cetera, is probably a topic for another day when Pat can join us. I always feel bad about topics like that, trying to do something like that without Pat here, because I know that that's one of Pat's Jeopardy categories, right? All things Star Trek is his Jeopardy category, and so I don't want to poach in his territory without giving him the opportunity to join us for that. But there's plenty of other science fiction out there that does these tropes. And I thought it would be useful to sort of look at some of those a little bit and sort of talk about why aircraft carriers exist in the real world and why they might or might not make sense in science fiction, and how you would do them if you wanted them to make sense.
And we've certainly got plenty of series that, take the science fiction, the aircraft carrier in space view of science fiction. Space Above and Beyond, Battlestar Galactica, Star Wars for that matter,
Stargate, and then plus a lot of stuff that only shows up in written science fiction. So there's lots of different options for that. So, so the first thing I would say is that naval platforms are defined by the media in which they operate, right? You've got basically 2 kinds of naval platforms. You've got the ones that are in the water. Well, 3 kinds if you want to separate submarines from surface ships. And you got the ones that are in the sky, in the air, right? And they operate differently. Ships have a fairly large capacity. You can make them very big. They have a very long endurance, but they're fairly slow, right? A really, really fast ship is 30 knots. It's going at 30 knots. Whereas an airplane can't even avoid from falling out of the sky at 30 knots. Helicopters can, but a fixed-wing aircraft can't. Airplanes, on the other hand, aircraft have a much smaller capacity and a much shorter endurance, but they have a lot higher speed. And aircraft carrier is kind of a way of having your cake and eating it too, right? You get all the advantages of the high speed, high performance, high maneuverability stuff of aircraft. But you also get to have the long endurance issues or capabilities of a ship, right? You can take your aircraft as far away from land as you need them. You can have them available on a moment's notice, and you can sort of care and feed for them at sea. And so an aircraft carrier is kind of a way of having your cake and eating it too. And the flight deck of an aircraft carrier is really a mechanism for moving between the sea and the sky. So if you think about an aircraft carrier is really sort of built around that flight deck, because airplanes have certain needs, right? You need a runway. And that's because air and sea work differently. So you need to have this mechanism that allows you to get from the sea to the sky. And an aircraft carrier flight deck is that mechanism. Now, the aircraft carrier flight deck also does other things. It's also where you park the airplanes. British carrier doctrine is that you have to be able, or at least World War II British carrier doctrine was you had to be able to strike everything below deck. But U.S. aircraft carrier doctrine from square one has been that you can leave stuff on the flight deck. You can leave it out. You can park in the driveway. You don't have to put everything in the garage. And that's why for a similar size aircraft carrier, we always carried a lot more airplanes than the Brits do. Because a large chunk of it was just a difference in our doctrine.
Now, so
yes,
does that mean that the British had, I mean, my initial thought were, well, you're parking everything underneath, so you have an armored flight deck.
Well, so
it getting bombed.
There's some design differences between British and U.S. aircraft carriers also, and I'm glad you pointed that out, because I was thinking about whether to include that or not, and the answer is yes, I should include that. So, U.S. aircraft carriers. If you go on an aircraft carrier, one of the things you might discover early on is that the flight deck of the aircraft carrier is considered the 04 level of the aircraft carrier. They number all the flight decks from the main deck, or all the decks from the main deck going up. It's 01, 02, 03, etc. From the main deck going down, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. And the main deck of an aircraft carrier is the hangar bay deck. It's not the flight deck. Well, why is that? It's because when they converted cruisers into aircraft carriers, they built this superstructure over the main deck. And they built it up. And those original flight decks were just wood that they had built up. You know, they might be a metal frame, but they were just wood. We continued with the wooden flight decks throughout World War II. So the armor was at the hangar bay level.
Above the hangar bay?
Yeah, the hangar bay, the floor of the hangar bay was armored, right? The floor of it.
The floor.
The flight deck itself was wood. Now, there's some advantages and disadvantages to that. The disadvantage, of course, is that the bomb goes right through the wood. The advantage of that is that it's actually much easier to repair the wood, right? You poke a hole in the metal, and now you've got to cut metal away, etc. Repairing wood is a lot easier than repairing metal. It also meant that U.S. aircraft carriers were they weren't as top heavy as the Brits, because the Brits did it the other way. The Brits armored their flight decks. Gotcha. And if you think about it, it makes sense. If you think about where are you likely to use these things? The U.S. from the beginning was thinking in terms of, we're going to be operating in the Pacific. We're going to be far away from land bases. The Brits early on were thinking in terms of like, yeah, we're going to operate in places like the Mediterranean, where there's a godzillion bases around. We're going to be dealing with land-based air all the time. They were expecting air attacks. They expected they were going to have bombers coming after them. And so they expected that having an armored flight deck was a good thing. Gotcha. Well, part of the problem with that is that makes your ship top heavy.
Right.
Because you've got armor up higher, right? And so it makes you top heavy. And so that's another reason why maybe they don't want as many planes up there, is because that just makes that top-heavy problem worse.
Right. Okay.
So we didn't armor our flight decks until post-war. I mean, even the late war carriers still had wooden flight decks. So let's see, where was I? So you've got a flight deck. You've got underneath the flight deck, you've got a hangar bay, which I've mentioned a couple of times. And so if you need to do major repairs to airplanes, you take them down below. In World War II, you might arm them below decks, etc. And you still might do that, but a lot of that stuff, you take it up to the flight deck and you fuel them, and you do everything on the flight deck because it increases your turnaround speed.
Mm-hmm.
And I do not have a full understanding of the intricacies of moving airplanes around on the flight deck, because every time I was on board an aircraft carrier, I was there to hunt submarines. And that flight deck stuff was just this thing that if I had a spare moment, I'd go up and I'd watch flight ops, but I wasn't spending any time sort of really thinking about the flight deck, except to the degree that that's where some of the anti-submarine helicopters lived, and I needed to know about the anti-submarine helicopters and what their status was. So you've got a hangar bay where you're going to fix stuff. You've got the flight deck where you're going to park stuff, and it also has the method of recovery, etc. You got to have some way to get between the hangar bay and the flight deck. And then you also want a fairly big ship, because the flight deck has to be pretty good size. You want the flight deck to be high above the ocean, because the closer to the surface it gets, the more likely it is going to be in turbulent air. And you want the air as nice and smooth as possible. Airplanes don't like turbulent air, especially on takeoff and landing. So you want to have nice, clean air, so you want it as high as possible. And you want it to be moving through the water as fast as possible, because wind over the flight deck gives you an advantage in being able to take off and land. It lowers the speed that the airplane needs to be generated for either takeoff or landing, right? It's got a certain minimum airspeed, and air coming over the flight deck counts. And the thing is, this isn't like landing at an airport. At an airport, you might have 6,000 feet of runway. On an aircraft carrier, you got about 800, if that. I mean, really, for an angled deck, you've got more like 600 tops. And so, factor of 10 difference. And as a result of that, you're a lot closer to your margin, right? There's not nearly as big a margin for error. So every little bit helps. So an aircraft carrier is really something that's sort of built around those salient features. I forgot the last part. So because you want it to be moving through the water as fast as possible, that means big engines. And that in turn means a bigger ship. So all these things sort of make the ship be as big as possible. And you're sort of building your ship around that flight deck, right? Flight deck is the flight deck is the reason why that ship exists. And you optimize for the flight deck. And then you've got a bunch of extra space, so you stick some command and control on there, and you stick these guys, and it's got a hospital and a dental clinic, and it's the local mail hub, and it does all these other things that in the old days battleships used to do a lot of that stuff, right? You'd have destroyers that have minimal medical facilities, and then the battleship's got its own hospital in it, right?
Right.
These days, all that stuff is on the aircraft carrier. So there's a pretty good-sized medical facility in the aircraft carrier. There's all sorts of other things that they do just because, A, they're a logistics hub, right? The mail comes out there first. So, it's the local UPS station. And B, you got to have that service somewhere, and they've got the space for it. So you do it there. And it's also where they got the greatest number of guys. So if you're going to put a hospital someplace, you're going to put it with the place that's got 5,000 people there, right? Not the place that has 150. Or 250 or 350 or whatever. I think cruisers are like 400 and Arleigh Burkes are like 250, if I remember correctly, something like that. Maybe 3 something. So you're building your aircraft carrier around this flight deck because you need to do that because of the difference in between the sea and the sky. Well, how much of that applies out in space? You don't really have this difference in media that drives the problem. So do you need to have a big flight deck? Or can you just have, a small bay and you push the fighter out and it kind of floats away and then lights its engine and goes away? Yeah, that's a good point. Mr. Voigt says you got to have all the munitions for the aircraft as well as aviation fuel. And then aviation fuel is a big deal. If you look at the difference in fuel needs for an all nuclear carrier battle group versus an all conventional carrier battle group, the amount of fuel needed is almost exactly the same. You would think, it's all nuclear, I need a lot less fuel. No, it's because the airplanes are what are using all the fuel. The ships are really kind of an afterthought. When you're talking about the volumes of jet fuel that you need to move to these ships, the extra fuel necessary for the ships themselves is just sort of like, okay, one more tanker and you've got it.
Right.
So,
yeah, because you got to believe they're constantly launching airplanes. The amount of fuel they're burning is insane.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like if you look at the total fuel use for the U.S. military, something like 85% of the fuel use for the U.S. military is airplanes, aircraft in general. Includes helicopters. Armored stuff uses a lot too, like tanks. Tanks have jet engines in them. Ships have jet engines in them. A gas turbine is a jet engine. In the case of the gas turbine on a surface ship, it's an LM 2500 or something like that, and it's basically a DC-8 engine or DC-9 engine that's been navalized. And so instead of it making the thing go by shooting hot air out the back and using that to propel you, the hot air is just sort of an extraneous thing. What it's really doing is it's turning its shaft, and that shaft is connected to something that goes to a gearbox that goes to a propeller shaft. And the gearbox turns the high speed, relatively low torque of a jet engine into the high torque, relatively low speed of a ship shaft. So gearboxes are very expensive. They're like, from what I was told somewhere, that they're the single most expensive thing on like a destroyer. The single piece of gear that's the most expensive is the gearbox, and that doesn't surprise me at all.
Wow. Okay.
So that's kind of where you start off with is, I look at aircraft carrier equivalents in science fiction, and my going in starting thing is, maybe you get to that as an answer, but you're not going to get there the same way that you would by looking at a U.S. aircraft carrier, like a real world aircraft carrier. Because in the real world, it's all about the difference between water and air, and it's all about the necessity of the flight deck as this thing that lets you move between the sea and the sky. And you don't really need that in space because there is no sea equivalent and sky equivalent. They're the same thing, right? You might have other reasons why you might want to do this, like you don't want to carry around all your life support and all that other stuff because it's going to decrease your combat performance. Or maybe you want to centralize all your resources because you get some economies of scale by doing that. But you don't do it out of this physical necessity that it's the only way that makes it work. Oh, and there's somebody out there who's talking about, who's thinking about, vertical takeoff and landing like the F-35B. You pay a lot for that. There's no such thing as a free launch.
Because it takes a lot more fuel to do a vertical launch than, right?
Yeah, and you pay for it. There's a lot of, it not only takes a lot more fuel to do that, but you can carry less fuel because you've got to carry the extra gear that lets you do vertical takeoff and landing. So you pay a penalty for that. You're never going to be as good with an airplane. There's a compromise that had to be made somewhere. And, a non-compromise VTOL capability is sort of the holy grail. And it's wonderful if you think about it. Like, what if you could take 5 F-35s and put them on all the ships in the fleet, and instead of building an aircraft carrier that's 100,000 tons and have a bunch of ships, a handful of ships with it that are all like 5 to 8,000 tons. What if you could just build like a battle group that has 15 ships that are 12,000 tons each? And you can put 5 airplanes on each one, or 6 airplanes on each one, or whatever, and move them around that way. That has a lot of things going for it. You're not putting all your eggs in one basket. It means that you degrade gracefully, right? You have some attrition. You don't automatically lose all your capability. There are advantages to having a high value unit and putting all your eggs in one basket if you can defend the basket. But it'd be nice to not have to think about it that way, right? It gives you more flexibility in terms of being able to right size. I mean, right now it's like aircraft carriers really only come in one size for some very valid reasons. What if I could just I'll add another 5 ships to that force, and that'll give me the extra capability I need. You don't have the place to put the hospital and all the other things, but my take on that is put all that stuff on the oiler, because you're going to have to fuel the things anyway. So you take all those hotel services sorts of things as additional services and put them on the oiler and make that work. So, if you could have a VTOL capability that you didn't have to pay this huge penalty for, you might want to do something like that. But in the real world, you actually do end up paying for that capability a lot. And we're really good at carrier battle group ops. We've been doing it for a long time now. We know how to make aircraft carriers work. That's one of the things with the Russians and the Chinese. Whenever everybody talks about, the Chinese are coming, they've got an aircraft carrier. Well, okay, yeah, but it's going to take them a while. It'll be easier for them than it was for us, because they'll be able to research what worked and what didn't work for us.
Right.
But they're huge machines. They're huge processes. They're huge organizations, and they've got lots of moving parts, and everybody needs to understand exactly what their job is. And it's really amazing that aircraft carriers work as well as they do, because they're largely kind of self-perpetuating. It's not like you send these young enlisted guys off to aircraft carrier school, or you don't, a lot of it's on the job training, and they've done studies on this, and they've discovered that they're really good about passing knowledge down to the next generation.
Yeah, institutional knowledge.
But it's amazing the way that they're able to sort of replicate this stuff through something that's essentially an analog process, right?
Right.
Yeah. And part of it is they just take it really seriously, and they work at it really, really hard. And it's only I think it was in the early 2000s when they finally got to the point where it wasn't guaranteed that you were going to have a couple of guys killed on a deployment. I mean, it was that serious. You could just expect that you were going to lose 3 or 4 guys.
Ooh.
On every time they went off just for a 6 to 8 month deployment, there were 3 or 4 guys that weren't going to come home.
Wow. Because
it was just that dangerous an environment.
Wow.
So when I look at now, I should say, space-going aircraft carriers ignore the differences in the media that drive the problem. It doesn't necessarily make sense to do it in that way. I notice how none of those words were me saying that space-going aircraft carriers aren't really, really cool, right? They are really, really cool, right? I would never say that you should not like something that you currently like just because you heard me say something about it not being really realistic, or I can't, as an analyst, I can't figure out how it makes sense. It's not the way to look at this. Space-going aircraft carriers are really cool, but I can also sort of put on my analytic hat and go, okay, but does that really make sense? Battlestar Galactica is always an interesting example of that, both the old show and the new one, because they both, there's another piece of this that I haven't really talked about. Aircraft carriers make sense because airplanes are really powerful. Airplanes generally have ship-killing weaponry in them, right? That's why they're a problem, is because they carry weaponry that can either seriously damage a ship or maybe even sink a ship by itself. What exactly does your average Viper carry that meets that criteria? They're largely kind of pew-pew type.
Yeah, right.
So they're good at doing the fighter part of a World War II carrier or wing. But, you know, the fighters were there for two reasons: to protect your own aircraft carrier and to protect the strike assets that were carrying the weapons that were ship-killing weapons.
Right.
So it wasn't really, if all you could do was have fighters on board, okay, maybe they're useful for spotting, but a fighter by itself wasn't real useful as a ship attack weapon. Now, am I saying that fighters didn't strafe ships? No, I'm not. And like, we sent fighters to Truk Atoll and had them shoot up a bunch of destroyers and transports and stuff like that. And, you know, 50 caliber rounds can ruin your whole day. And again, something small like a destroyer, you could seriously screw them up badly. You could kill people. You could damage them. If nothing else, you kept the other guys on sort of on the edge of their seat. But you know, you don't talk about, I'm going to strafe the enemy battleship and I'm going to beat the enemy battleship by shooting 50 cal rounds at it, right? So that's the first question about Battlestar Galactica, is what exactly is the thing I've got that's going to kill this ship? I liked in the new Battlestar Galactica about how they had they had the I'm drawing a blank.
Raptors.
Yeah, they had the Raptor along. Now, they talk about the Raptor as being an electronic warfare sensor platform, etc. You don't see a whole lot of that. I think in one of the episodes you did see them do something like that, but by and large, they just sort of seem to be a bigger ship.
They were just tugs, basically.
Yeah, and you know, part of it is you use what you've got. So if you need to do personnel transfers, they can do personnel transfers, and they're perfectly fine for that. But I got real excited early on when they talked about them doing electronic warfare stuff, because I thought I was going to get to see electronic warfare in space, and that'd be really cool. And then they didn't really show any of that. So
it wasn't until the last episode, into Daybreak, when they're attacking the Cylon base ship, that you actually saw like missile carrying versions of Raptors.
Yeah, and then every now and then you'd see something like that. And you know, the question I always have in science fiction when a new capability develops is, why haven't we seen that before?
Because the writer hadn't needed it at that point.
Yeah, and it's like, you know, all of a sudden the Galactica has these big missiles. Wouldn't those have been useful earlier? And sometimes the answer is no, they weren't. Sometimes when you think that, and then when you go back and you check, it's like, okay, I'll grant you that there was never really that same situation before, so maybe it wasn't. But a lot of times it's clearly they just decided we're gonna add this thing. You know, it reminds me of that scene in Galaxy Quest. This was a very stupid episode. This was a poorly written episode where you had the big giant hammers, and they had to get through them. It's like, why was that there? Well, in this case, it's like, why didn't we see it early? Yeah, Raptors can carry nukes, but you didn't really see a whole lot of that, nearly as much as you would expect, I think. There's a deleted scene that shows the Galactica detonating all of its nukes right before the attack happens, because they were disarming the ship. They were in the process of disarming the ship. So I don't remember if we ever got a count on exactly how many nukes that they had on the Galactica. That I need to go back and rewatch that series. So Galactica, the various versions of Galactica is a good example of what I will call a pure aircraft carrier model, right? It really is about a carrier. You see some hybrid models in like things like Stargate and Babylon 5, where in Babylon 5, you've got these huge warships that carry like a small number of fighters, sort of like I described earlier as a possibility. In Stargate, they look more like aircraft carriers, some of the Earth ships, in that they've got these big flight bays. In both of them, you sort of have the same question as to why exactly are they useful? In a big fleet action, what exactly are these fighters going to do? And every now and then you get some hints of bigger weapons, but it never is clear enough to me that they've got like a doctrine that they've sort of optimized for that mission. In Babylon 5, fighters always seemed to make the most amount of sense to me when they were dealing with pirates and other small ships, right? They seem to make a lot less sense when the big boys are dancing. And I'm reminded a lot of how, in Age of Sail times, when you fought a big fleet action, the frigates were not in the line of battle because they didn't really have anything to contribute to that kind of battle. And so in a small battle, you might have frigates lining up against each other and fighting. But as a general rule, when you had like the big fleet action and you've got a large line, the frigates stayed out of it because they actually didn't bring enough wherewithal to the table, and they were actually a weak point in the line because they were so much smaller and they could be pretty much damaged. So you kept them out, and it sort of seems the same to me with fighters and a lot of these things. But I like the idea of a hybrid carrier. I'll note though, in the real world, that's an idea that never really got very far. And it's because you can optimize to be a battleship or you can optimize to be an aircraft carrier, but if you're trying to do both, by definition, you're sub-optimizing one or the other. A battleship is wanting to kind of be in the line, it's wanting to be close enough, to see the enemy, and it's wanting to maneuver in a particular way. Aircraft carriers don't want to be that close to the enemy, and they maneuver entirely differently because they care about pointing their nose into the wind. They're not maneuvering to cross the other guy's T or do any of the things that battleships would do. They've got an entirely different set of maneuver constraints. So it turns out that when you try to do both of those things, you end up with something that's a really bad aircraft carrier and a really bad battleship. Plus, add 100,000 gallons of aviation gas and imagine how much more sporty that makes the situation, right? So hybrids don't make sense in the real world. They might make more sense in science fiction because you don't need that flight deck and you don't have to optimize for the wind and all those other things. I've often thought that torpedo boats might be a better model than fighters. You see that in David Weber's Honorverse. He will foot stomp and I'll foot stomp that light attack craft are not fighters. I mean, those things are the size of an Arleigh Burke class destroyer. They're huge. They're a little bit smaller dimension-wise, but they weigh a lot more. They're huge. They only have a crew of 20, but they're tens of thousands of tons of displacement.
Right.
So they're really something, if you had to bin it in our nomenclature, corvette works as well as anything, right? So, or torpedo boat might be a good one. And so in the Honorverse, you really see torpedo boat carriers.
And Art, if I can just interrupt for a second,
Yeah.
The whole basis for these discussions, aircraft carriers, what in space, what do they do? Really, you got to back up and say, well, what are the technologies, the offensive and defensive technologies you're dealing with? Because I always think that fundamentally the difference between a Battlestar Galactica and Star Trek, just to make it as simple as possible, Star Trek, everyone's got shields, and little fighters aren't going to do shit against them.
Yeah.
In Battlestar Galactica, no one had shields, and you were attacking their primary hull, and so therefore fighters made sense. I mean, so anyway, go from there.
Yeah, there's a Dilbert cartoon where Dilbert says the facts don't lie, but luckily the assumptions do lie. And so in this particular case, I think it really comes down to your technological assumptions. And you know, at one level that sounds really trite. Well, of course it comes down to your technology. But my point in all of this is that so you talk about principles of strategy, right? Strategy is kind of timeless, right? The principles of strategy of today are pretty much the same as you could apply those same principles of strategy to 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, whatever. You know, things about concentration of force and things along those lines. You know, attacking the enemy's strength, things along those lines. You know, the thought processes make a lot of sense. Tactics is very technologically dependent, and so battles are very technologically dependent, and warship design is very technologically dependent. And some authors understand that better than others. David Weber understands that stuff great, and you know, he talks about how in his technological timeline there are times when there are changes in the technology that lead to changes in the optimal warship design that make older ships obsolete. And so, you know, and he understands also other things like you keep, even though your ship may be obsolescent and you would never build it now, that doesn't mean you throw it away. It takes a little bit of time to sort of get stuff out of the fleet because you can only build so many hulls. And there are times where you just say, you know, 20 years ago, this was a first line ship. Now it's a second line ship, but I'm going to have to use it because I need the mass, right? I need the fighting power, and some of it's in these older ships. So whenever somebody starts talking about, you know, what would win, the Enterprise or the Battlestar Galactica or whatever, I always avoid those conversations because they come from such different technological backgrounds. It's sort of like saying, what's better, German or French? It's like, you know, that you can't really compare them like that, right? Tell me what you want to do with it. Tell me, you know, in whose terms, in whose universe am I having this fight? Because they really don't mix very well. And you end up with much different assumptions on how you put all that stuff together. So I like David Weber's stuff with the lax because he's thought all that stuff through. There's an author by the name of Scott Geyer who got caught in the midlist purge at Del Rey. He wrote three books in a series called Ganellan, and then he later wrote a fourth book and published it through Mike McCollum's Sci Fi Arizona site. He had motherships that had carried corvettes. The motherships had the FTL capability. The corvettes did not have an FTL capability, but that's where the combat power was. If you're a Traveler fan, you're probably saying, oh yeah, that's a battle rider. And it's like, yeah, it really kind of is. It's a battle rider, right? Although they were a lot smaller than a classic Traveler battle rider. And you know, those work really well. I mean, he thought that all through. That series is also interesting because I read that series and I was partway through the first book and I went, the author is a naval aviator, I can tell. My guess was he was a P3 guy, and when I contacted him and said, hey, you a naval aviator by chance? It turns out he had graduated from the Naval Academy, tail end of the Vietnam War, that time period. Went off, did a tour at sea, assigned to an air wing, assigned to a squadron in an air wing, but was not rated. So he hadn't been to flight school or anything like that. With the post-Vietnam drawdown, they basically gave him the option of leaving. They basically, you know, said, we'll let you out of your commitment. It's going to be rough for a bunch of people. We'll let you out of your commitment early if you go now. And he went, I'll do that, and left. But if you read his book, I could tell that he was an aviator because anytime the characters did something that there would be a checklist for, you could sort of see them going through the checklist in their head. He's not detailing the checklist, but things always occurred in the same order. When they got on the radio, they always said the same words when they're launching, because there's a procedure for that, and you follow the procedure. So that worked really well. Now, in the real world, it turns out we actually did create, we being the French in this case, we actually did create a torpedo boat carrier back in 18 something or another. It was called the Le Foudre. They had taken a cruiser and they put some cranes on it so that they could carry like 10 torpedo boats, and they could put them in the water at sea. This is an idea that works better in science fiction than it does in the real world, because in the real world you have wind and weather and waves and all that other stuff. Torpedo boats are actually quite limited in the real world. They really need sheltered areas. So it turns out, in one of the great ironies, a torpedo boat destroyer is a better torpedo boat than a torpedo boat is. So torpedo boats only really work in sheltered waters, like inland waters and stuff like that. They're really pretty good, but as a general rule, at sea they have sea keeping issues, and it doesn't work nearly as good as you might think. And in modern times, there's a certain premium on big sensors, right? The Aegis radar system is a big radar system. So to some degree, you need bigger stuff. But in science fiction, the idea of a torpedo boat cruiser makes a lot of sense. I would argue, I think it makes a lot more sense. And then you've got weird stuff like C.J. Cherryh, who sort of combined the idea of a hybrid, in her case, battleship and troop ship, and thing that carries something that you could call a rider. And so she's basically got hybrid troop torpedo boat carriers that are also battleships. And that's in her Alliance Union universe, like Down Below Station and Hellburner and those things. And they work. I think that is actually a really good model. And first time I read Hellburner, I thought it was okay. Second time I read it, I thought it was one of the 10 best books I'd ever read. And in part, it's because when I read it the first time, I was working at either an internet software company or an Italian pharmaceutical company. I can't remember which. When I read it the second time, it was after I'd gone to CNA and I had a much better idea of how the military works. And there was a lot of stuff in there that really rang true about how research and development programs work and things like that. Like at one point, one of the characters explains to the congressional committee, no, the reason why we're behind is because you gave us a crappy space station to base at, and we're having to spend all of our development money to keep the space station from killing us. So we had to move a whole bunch of money from the research accounts into the operations and maintenance accounts to keep the space station from, just leaking all the air out.
And what series is this?
It's part of the Alliance Union universe. So the first book in that really made a splash was Down Below Station. And then Down Below Station, Merchanter's Luck, Cytine, the two Cytine books, Infinity's End, Hellburner, and the Hellburner there was a book before Hellburner. Hellburner and the prequel to it take place a lot earlier than the other books do. And so they're fantastic. Yep, that's it. So they're all fantastic. Although I love C.J. Cherryh, but I find that I have to be in the right mood to read one of those books, because they can be, there aren't really good guys in a lot of ways, and they can be really kind of depressing. And if I'm not in the right mood for the book, the right answer is to move on. But she once wrote a book where the big climactic scene, Tripoint, which is another book in that series, the big climactic scene is a cargo transfer. And it was fantastic. Now there's an enemy warship bearing down on them, so they're rushing it. They're doing it in about a third the time that they should be doing it in. And as a result, they're moving multi-ton pallets around and people are getting crushed and stuff like that. And I've often said that at some point, C.J. Cherryh is going to write a novel where the climactic scene is going to be that the main character goes to an automated coffee machine and gets coffee. And I can't wait because it's going to be fantastic. Because she's just such a great writer.
Because I see we're a little over our time here. So is this a good time for us to cut, and then we can pick this up again next week? Or do you think we wrap up the conversation on carriers? Or
we should at least have some conversation about how fighters work in Star Trek and to the degree that they make sense, etc. You know, Pat and I were talking just earlier today about the difference between the idea of, well, we know it makes sense in Star Trek because they showed it to us. And I'm a little bit less sanguine about that. I'm much more inclined to say, like, yeah, but it doesn't make sense. And yeah, it's officially canon. But when I'm having a conversation like this, I don't have conversations like this to explain why Star Trek or anybody else is right. You know, I'm not trying to use the analysis to say, just to go in with the idea of, I'm going to explain how that really makes sense. It's more along the lines of, I do this in my day job. My hobby is science fiction. I think I can add value to the discussion of the science fiction by applying some of the tools and knowledge from my day job. And so I'm perfectly okay with the idea of saying, all right, I'll press the I believe button because they put it in there, but really I don't think it makes any sense. So, and then you've got things like Wing Commander, which I will admit is a guilty pleasure. I actually really like the Wing Commander movie, despite the fact that everything about that movie is just wrong.
All right, hold on. Someone keeps calling. Yes. Hello. All right, I don't know why this person keeps calling me.
But yeah,
it's spam. It's a chick with big boobs, so she's clearly just spamming me. Who the hell is this person? Why do they keep calling me on Skype? All right, so. Tell us about Wing. I haven't seen Wing Commander in at least 10 years. I do remember that I really enjoyed it. Despite the awful cast, I remember just Freddie.
Some members of that cast are better than others. I mean, what's his name? David Warner is always good.
Oh yeah, David Warner is brilliant.
Jürgen Prochnow would have been better if they didn't have him doing the Nazi emulation the entire way through.
Right, exactly.
I thought that there are other places where it's like, okay, really, that's how you're going to do that? I mean, you're going to show the Admiral's ring to indicate that you've got that the Admiral trusts you, as opposed to just sort of saying, like, why don't you check the secret orders? There was nothing wrong with the big picture story. The implementation had a lot of problems, but the big picture story idea of the Kilrathi capture a NAVCOM AI, now they have the coordinates to Earth, the fleet's out of position, I really need you to intercept these guys, A, give me enough reconnaissance that I can find out what I'm dealing with, and B, slow them up. I just need 24 hours. Just give me 24 hours and I can get the fleet in place. And then they add on to it. Oh, by the way, there's going to be spoilers in my discussion. And then they add on to it the idea of they see this opportunity to turn the table on them. And they call an audible and they turn the table on them. And it goes from being a possibility of the worst day of the war for us into this shooting ducks in a barrel. There was nothing wrong with any of that. But then they had to add things like the bulldozer that pushes the wrecked fighter off the flight deck. They had to add the, don't get into a vertical fight with them. It's like, it's in space. There is no vertical. There is none, there was the two characters falling madly in love. When if you think about how long they actually knew each other, it was about like 15 hours tops.
Yeah. Right.
And they're acting like the one character's acting like he'd known her for his entire life. You know, like they'd been married for a decade. Like, really? Yeah. But there are things about. I mean, I keep going back to it. I watch it about once every year or two.
Oh wow. Okay, I'm gonna have to go back and check it out.
So
Yeah, I'll have to check it out wherever I can see it. But cool. Well, listen. Another fascinating discussion. I hope everyone else enjoyed it. You could tell who the people that were in the Navy because they were geeking out on all this shit.
Yeah, and I'm going to try to go through the tomorrow if I get a chance. I'm going to try to go through the chat and see if there's any questions, and then post them to the comment section, and probably also on the Facebook page. I did that the last time because it's just impossible to really read the chat and have the conversation at the same time. I knew that was going to be hard. It turns out to be really, really hard.
Yeah, it's totally impractical. I know. So, all right. Well, that would be great. We will listen. We will all be back next Saturday once again. Pat will or won't be with us next Saturday.
Probably not next Saturday, but we will have him the Saturday after. So we'll have to delay a week to have the fighters and Star Trek conversation with him, and I'll think about another good topic to talk about. One of the interesting things we see in Star Trek, or we don't see in Star Trek because the fleets are so small. We've talked a little bit about this, the idea of command and control. There might be something in there that we can talk about. I'll do some thinking about it. They're really persistent.
I know. I don't know. I didn't know how to block. I got to figure out how to block this person. I don't even know what they're calling on. And so, but all right.
What have you bought an extended car warranty yet? Maybe that's it.
Is that it? They're hitting me up for an extended warranty. Oh God! All right. Well, listen. Thanks so much. It was another great Saturday night. It was always time well spent. I'll know by next Saturday night. I'll know whether or not I have COVID-19, and we will keep you all posted. Thanks, Taken. Sorry. Thanks everyone. We appreciate everyone sticking around. We kind of went long tonight, but that's all good. We'll see. We'll look forward to chatting with Pat again. Whether or not he's with us next Saturday, we'll certainly have Chris Weave here. And Chris, good luck at your job this week. Keep the free world safe. And
it's been fun working at home. So it's been going pretty well. One thing that we should do next week is it might be a little bit late to do it, although if people think about it real quickly, if you all got topics you'd want me to talk about, talk about, please put them in the chat or put them on the Facebook page or something like that. And
do a Starfleet tactical AMA.
Yeah, and so I can't promise that I'm equally deep on all of this stuff. There's some things I know about way more than others, but if there's some particular piece of it you want to hear about, let me know.
Great. All right, everyone. Thank you as always. I hope everyone's doing well. Please stay safe. Wear your damn mask, and we will see you guys next Saturday, same time, same Starfleet Tactical time, same Starfleet Tactical channel. Cheers, everyone.